Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sask Wheat's fourth webinar, Think Wheat webinar of 2022. I'm Dallas Carpenter. I'm the Communications Manager of Sask Wheat. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We're pleased to bring you excellent speakers and relevant topics that provide you with information that you can apply directly to your farm. We have a number of great agronomy resources available on our website, from our Wheat Watch documents, which cover topics such as seed testing and herbicide carryover, to our Wheat Profit podcast, which covers topics such as managing herbicide shortages and fungicide timing. We have another Wheat Profit podcast coming out next week. Our agronomy extension specialist, Haley Tatro, will be interviewing Les Henry about the soil moisture outlook for this year. So keep an eye on our website and our Twitter feed for that. We will have a limited amount of time at the end of the presentation for questions. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and I will read them out. And I will do my best to get to all the questions at the end of Blake's presentation. So let's get on to that. So the coming crop year will see significant nutrient variability across fields due to impacts of drought. Input prices are extremely high, so management strategies such as variable rate application will be very important to producers who will be looking to get the most efficient use out of fertilizers. Today's speaker, Blake Weiseth, has access to the latest research in variable rate fertilizer application through his position at Glacier FarmMedia Discovery Farm applied research as the Glacier FarmMedia Discovery Research Applied Research Lead. Blake will present the latest data from his field trials to answer your questions. And with that, Blake, thank you for being here today. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dallas, for the kind introduction and for to Sask Wheat for organizing this webinar overall. Really happy to be having the chance to share today. So just bear with me as I share my slide deck. And I think it should be on the screen, Dallas, if you can give me a quick nod.
Yes, you bet.
Perfect. All right, we're good to go. So yeah, thank you for the introduction and thanks to everyone for taking in today's presentation. Of course, the topic that we're talking about is variable rate fertilizer application, ultimately with the goal of optimizing our nutrient use efficiency across the field. And so for today's presentation, I'll be drawing on largely the results from our demonstration and research projects taking place at Discovery Farm Langham, as well as another project that is led by Dr. Jeff Shano, as I have the good fortune of working with him as I'm currently a PhD student in the soil science department at University of Saskatchewan. But first, just by way of introduction on the topic of variable rate fertilizer application, for me, it starts with 4R nutrient stewardship, which I trust is a concept that many of you are familiar with, but just as a quick refresher, this is a management decision-making framework that asks growers that are making fertilizer application decisions to consider the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And I think it is important to frame a conversation of variable rate fertilizer within the context of all the 4Rs, because it seems simple at surface level to think about it. However, we know that practically there are a number of factors that can complicate this decision, particularly coming up with the proper rate of fertilizer for a given field and at your farm. And at the individual farm level, we know that other management considerations all feed into how these 4Rs are implemented. So examples including considerations like your equipment availability, logistics, crop rotation, and other things. And another complicating factor is that the agronomic performance of a given fertilizer product may be influenced by different interactions between the 4Rs. So keep that in mind. I'll be touching on that a little later in the presentation, but I just wanted to introduce it for now. So now, of course, within the context of the right rate, In theory, of course, what we want to do is determine the optimum nutrient use efficiency. And by that, we mean we want to maximize the uptake and use of the fertilizer by the crop for whatever end use we have, if it's the harvested grain or the biomass, and to limit any potential losses. And I think this is certainly a win-win situation. Of course, Dallas just introduced, the high fertilizer prices and other things. And so we want to make best use of that fertilizer, right? We're paying good money for it. We want it, of course, to go into the crop. And again, while that seems simple to come up with the right rate in theory, in practice, it can be complicating. And there are a number of considerations that go into what is that right rate. Of course, things like the crop choice, recognizing that each crop has a unique demand for nutrients, your equipment configuration or availability. So by that, I mean, your commodity cart on your seeding equipment, does it have enough tanks to get all the products on that you want at the time of seeding? What is your opener configuration like? How does that influence the safe rates of nutrients that you're able to apply to not have any negative impact on germination and emergence? Your fertilization strategy in general, within the context of phosphorus as an example, are you interested in taking sort of a short-term sufficiency approach, or interested in more of a long-term outlook to perhaps build the reserves of a nutrient in your soil over time? And it might be influenced by, as an example, whether you rent the land or you own it. Your yield goals and your tolerance to risk, fertilizer costs, again, which impacts all the above factors. And then specifically for today, are you implementing a fixed rate or a variable rate of nutrients? Now, in terms of the foundation for variable rate fertilizer application, in terms of a theoretical sense, it's based on the assumption that plant available nutrient concentrations can vary significantly across a field, as well as your plant demand for those nutrients can vary spatially across the field for a number of factors. So therefore, a fixed rate of nutrients may result in significant over and under application of nutrients across the field. And to illustrate that, what I have here on the screen is a summary of soil test results from one of our fields at Discovery Farm Langham, where we have currently broken down into different management zones. And I'll talk about that coming up here right away, but you can see various soil parameters reported according to the different zones. So I'll draw your attention to the column N19, which this is nitrate measured in pounds per acre. And so you can see there's quite significant variation across the field from 17 all the way up to 63 in zones 7 and 8. If you look at the phosphorus, in this case, it's Olsen test phosphorus, quite homogeneous in zones 1 through 8. However, we get a large bump in zones 9 and 10 to the degree of 31 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram, where we might not expect to see a response to applied nutrients. Our sulfur number is 29 parts per million in zones 1 and 2, and then we get a large increase in the upper zones. So because of this, we can see that there is variation in these residual nutrients across the field. So from that, we can see that there's this variation in nutrient concentrations, and the goal is to delineate different management zones within the field, which seeks to really understand what we initially might consider as random variability into some sort of systematic variability that we can manage uniquely through these different management zones. And again, the goal is to ensure that that crop has sufficient access to nutrients by matching our residual nutrients and fertilizer application rates to the crop demand. Now, there are a number of strategies for delineating management zones, and I'll just touch on 2 of them that we're using in different projects at Discovery Farm Langham. On one instance, you can use soil-based methods, which is the image on the left. And another method might use remote sensing-based methods using different indices of crop productivity. So starting with soil-based methods, really the idea here is to identify areas of homogeneous soil characteristics within the field, and topography can be a good basis for understanding this, given its influence on water movement within the field. We know that water has a pronounced impact on different nutrient transformations in the field, as well as can redistribute things like organic matter and clay across the field due to water erosion. So that can be a good basis for delineating a unique management zones. And the image on the screen here, what we're looking at is essentially a digital elevation model that was created from our field site at Discovery Farm Langham. You can see the different slope or topographic positions, the water collecting areas in the field as the whited out areas, and the water flow paths running to them. One example of where this has been shown to be effective is again within plant available phosphorus, which previous research has shown that it is highly correlated with topography within the field. So with this method though, of course, it does require some sort of physical investigation of the site to measure soil properties. And so there are logistical considerations associated with that for sure. The second method that I'll touch on is what I'm calling remote sensing based methods. And the idea here is to really attempt to identify areas of homogeneous crop productivity within the field. So different indices from satellite imagery, such as normalized difference vegetation index, or your yield maps that you're collecting from your combine yield monitor, can be used to identify this variation. One point that I'll mention behind this is that it is important to consider multiple years of data to help interpret year-to-year variability. So in this image on the screen here, you can see that it's stacking multiple years of NDVI imagery from 2012 to current, and really just trying to understand the average productivity across the field. And one example I'll give is in the 2021 year at Discovery Farm Langham, we came out of a very severe drought. And it turns out that our low-lying areas, the water collecting areas of the field, were our most productive. Now, you can contrast that to, for example, the early 2010s, where we had a number of historic wet years, where these areas may have been suffered from low productivity due to periodic flooding and the like. So again, the important thing is by having multiple years, you can try to understand, some of the variability from a year-to-year perspective, but this is certainly an effective method as well. Now, once you've delineated those management zones, as a soil scientist myself, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that taking soil tests to understand residual nutrient characteristics is a good place to start to come up with those rates. However, the soil sampling approach that you're taking is extremely important for getting good quality results from a soil test. And part of the reason for this is, of course, in Saskatchewan and much of the prairies here, we commonly take a direct seeding approach, and this can result in significant stratification of nutrients. By that, I mean accumulation of nutrients near the soil surface, especially within the context of phosphorus as an immobile nutrient, as well as microscale variability, largely based on where those bands of nutrients are being placed within the field. And so a consideration of your fertilizer placement strategy is very important in deciding where you're taking those soil sample locations. And so strip sampling may be an effective strategy considered in contrast to traditional cores that we collect, or certainly multiple cores to understand that variation. And so to illustrate that, I have this figure on the screen here that just shows a number of common opener configurations for seeding equipment. So starting at the top with sort of the simple approach with seed placed fertilizer being placed in the same furrow as your seed. Another option, of course, would be a sideband situation where your fertilizer is placed below into the side of your seed, or a mid-row style opener where you would have nutrients in between two rows of seed. Of course, in a double shoot system, you could have nutrients applied within the seed row as well in both the mid-row and the sideband configuration. But in any case, I just want to talk about how the location of our soil cores may influence the soil test results we're seeing. So as an example here, if we were to take a core in the sideband configuration right at the location of that band, you would get quite a different plant available nutrient concentration than, for example, the mid-row location. And so it's important to consider that when you're doing sampling. Maybe it's a matter of taking cores from both of these locations to come up with sort of an average number, or a strip across the row and inter-row locations to identify that average fertility level. And once you have done your soil tests, you have your management zones, then your fertilization strategy comes into effect. And what I mean by that is, as an example, how are you going to approach these different zones within the field? As an example being, how would you approach your knolls or hilltops? Do you, on one hand, increase your fertilizer application rate to build productivity of these soils that may have suffered from erosion, topsoil being removed downslope, or do you decrease your fertilizer application rate to save money and redistribute those nutrients to the more productive areas of the field? No inherent wrong or right answer. It's simply a matter of how you individually want to approach it. So with that stage set, now I'll move on to talking about some of the results from demonstration projects we have underway at Discovery Farm Langham. But first, by way of introduction for Discovery Farm, this may be a relatively new term for some of you on the call. I trust you are familiar with the site, though, as it is the home of Ag in Motion. But Discovery Farm is really the name of our entire site, and we think of ourselves as a hub of applied research, knowledge transfer, and dissemination activities. And if I had to distill what we do into three main areas, it is in the areas of research, demonstration, and then importantly, knowledge transfers. We're very much interested in getting the story out of what we're doing, but also importantly, to hear from you folks about the types of things you're interested in, wanting to know more, what are your research topics? And on that point, I definitely encourage through the question period at the end, or folks to connect with me afterwards. Would very much be interested in hearing your thoughts insofar as variable rate fertilizer or research projects that we can look at in the future. And all that we do is for the goal of really understanding and addressing some of those challenges that are currently facing Canadian farmers. So talking from the 2020 field season, this is a variable rate prescription that was developed for our Field of Excellence project at Discovery Farm Langham. So in this year, we seeded the field to hard red spring wheat. CDC Hughes varietal blend is the variety. And you can see the prescription here. I'll just walk you through it just to introduce it. So in this system of delineating management zones, there are 10 zones across the field that relate to the color schematic that you can see on the image. And the zones in general are based on an understanding of electrical connectivity across the field, underlying soil characteristics, and then modeling topography throughout the field. So as an example, zones 1 through 3, these tend to be your upslope knoll positions. They may be sandy, they likely are low in organic matter. Zones 4, 5, and 6 are about your mid-slope locations. And zones 7 through 10 tend to be the low line or water collecting areas within the field. And in this instance, we had a layer of variable rate seed for wheat, as well as 2 fertilizer layers. One is a blend of phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and then a straight urea layer. Now, before I get into the details on the prescription, again, starting with the soil test results, which was the basis of setting these rates. So this shows extractable nutrient concentrations according to the different groupings of zones. You can see, for example, nitrate in pounds per acre. There is some variation across the field. The Olsen phosphorus is relatively consistent, only a spread of 12 to 15 parts per million. But we do see, importantly, I'll draw your attention to the salinity column. So this is electrical conductivity, where we have, relatively low rates in the majority of the zones with a sharp spike in zones 9 and 10. And so we can say that there is a moderate yield limitation to salinity at this site. And so I think that was important in how we informed the prescription that we developed for this site. Looking at the urea layer, in general, we're increasing our rate of urea, this is in pounds per acre, from 150 in zone 1, capping out at 170 in zone 5. So the reason is that we're assuming that these mid-slope locations are going to be our areas of highest productivity within the field. And then we're dialing down our rate in the areas that may suffer from water accumulation, but importantly, salinity in the highest zones of 9 and 10. For the phosphorus, potassium, sulfur blend, same sort of strategy in general, where we're decreasing our rates significantly as we get to those upper zones. Now, this table here is a breakdown of the economic analysis that we did. So we have our 10 zones across the left, then we have our revenue based on the average yield for each zone and our commodity price for wheat. Our input costs, you'll notice that this does vary according to the different zones as it's related to the variable rates of seed and fertilizer that were applied. Our machinery costs are fixed, and for this exercise, I took published custom machinery rental rates. Of course, this number would vary under each grower's unique situation, but just for relative sake, we considered it that way. And then determining the profit, which of course is what we're interested in. So in this case, we see that our highest profitability was seen in these middle zones, especially in zone 5. And so this is what we expected. This was what we predicted would be the highest productivity area of the field. Within the majority of the zones, our profit margin is relatively tight, and I think that speaks to how we're managing some of our input costs through reducing our fertilizer rates in these upper zones, as an example, thereby having an impact on the profitability. I will draw your attention to zone 1, where we did have a low profit in this area. And I think part of the reason is reflected in the lowest yield that we observed in this site. And if you recall back to 2020, or certainly at our Langham site, we had pretty good moisture status throughout the majority of the year, but about by the second half of the year, really the taps shut off. And so we had, I think, a yield penalty in these water shedding areas from a lack of moisture. Now looking at 2021, this is the same field. In this year, we had flax, and you can see our variable rate prescription for flax seed. And then in this case, we had 3 different blends of fertilizer, monoammonium phosphate as a bulk product, a blend of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. And then this blend here is another nitrogen and phosphorus blend, where nitrogen is in the form of ESN, or polymer coated urea, environmentally smart nitrogen. And so looking at, again, the soil test results, we can see, now I'll draw your attention to N20 for the extractable nitrate in the fall of 2020. You can see higher residual nitrate levels. Again, I think a reflection of that drought conditions towards the end of the year. And there is certainly some variation across the zones. For Olsen phosphorus, fairly uniform. However, starting to see some of these numbers are quite low, 4 parts per million in zone 7 or 8. So this is certainly something we wanted to address in the prescription. And then now starting to see a bit of a spread in our sulfur as well, where especially high numbers in some of these upper zones within the field. We know that in Saskatchewan, much of the salinity that we see in these groundwater discharge areas is in the form of sulfate salts. So these areas tend to have high accumulations of sulfur. So now just to walk you through the prescription. So I'll start with the map layer, really fairly consistent across the field. The goal here was to have this in a sideband to provide that good early season, or in the seed row to provide that good early season access to phosphorus, dropping the rates somewhat in these higher zones, expecting that that's going to be the area of lowest productivity. With the NPKS blend, a similar strategy to what we did in 2020, where we have our highest rates in those middle zones and then dropping off in the upper zones. I want to talk about this ESN phosphorus blend, and this is the example that I mentioned in the introduction about interactions between some of the 4Rs. So in this case, talking about the interaction, between the source and the rate. So we know ESN, a polymer coated urea, is designed to limit losses due to leaching. And so in this instance, we had a low rate on the areas where we deemed risk of leaching losses to be relatively low, but then increased our rate as our available moisture status increased. So I think this can be an interesting example of how we're practically looking at, what is the best product and what is the best rate for our different management zones within the field. This shows the economic analysis from that same field. So by the different zones, again, you'll notice at the outset that our yields were quite low from this field, and it was a reflection of the severe drought that we had in the 2021 season. Despite that, we did see some profit in certain areas of the field. In this case, interestingly, our highest profitability was in zone 8 and in general in the upper zones. And I think the reason for this in this year with such a severe drought, any area of the field that did have some extra moisture accumulating in these low-lying areas did help the yield. And it was that case until the upper zone, we did see a bit of a yield penalty, I think, where that impact of salinity is coming into effect. In the upper zones, you'll notice we had a loss in these zones, and I think it is simply a reflection of the poor yield from the drought conditions was not able to overcome the input costs. So I think this is an important place to stop and talk about one of the challenges with a variable rate program is to try to predict, what is going to be your most productive area of the field where you're probably going to be directing your nutrients, and it will be impacted by the growing season condition. So now I'll talk about the other strategy we use at Discovery Farm Langham for delineating these management zones. And this is in a project that we have called the Nutrient Ag Solutions Innovation Acres Project, a great partnership with Nutrient Ag Solutions at Discovery Farm Langham. And in this case, we use their echelon variable rate program for delineating these management zones and coming up with our rates. So in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the prescription is based on historic NDVI imagery, so several years to try to understand that long-term productivity across the field. And in this case, 10 years are sort of hand selected to try to best come up with that average productivity. Also, predicted weather patterns are fed into this to try to predict what that's going to look like, and nitrogen mineralization is accounted for. Again, speaking to the importance of collecting soil samples to understand your available nutrients coming from the soil. So this is a really neat project that we have at Discovery Farm Langham in the Innovation Acres project, where we have 4 fields, 10 acres in size each, and partnering with Nutrient Ag Solutions to go through really just testing a crop rotation over multiple years, focusing on cereals and oil seeds. So we have within any given year, wheat, barley, flax, and canola being grown. And in this instance, the image that you're looking at on the screen is the prescription that was developed for the barley field. But within each of the 4 10-acre fields, soil sampling was done to determine the rates of nutrients. And an important point on sort of the strategy in this approach is that a grower would set sort of their average nutrient fertilizer rates for the field. And then the program really redistributes those fertilizer across the field to try to increase rates on the historic areas of high productivity and dial the rates down on the areas of low productivity. In this, the image that you're seeing in the middle of the screen is the variable rate prescription that was developed for the barley field. So just to walk you through it, in terms of the rates that was applied, the red and orange areas is the lowest rates of nitrogen fertilizer. And this really speaks to the yield limitation of salinity in certain areas of the field. And then the highest rates is in the blue areas. And the yield map you can see on the right side of the screen outlined in the black box. So I think importantly in the 2021 year and in the midst of the severe drought that we did suffer, field variability was very pronounced. And I think this does speak to the value of using the historic NDVI imagery to set the basis of our fertilizer prescription across the field. So now let's look at some research project results that we have underway and that I'm leading as a part of my PhD research. The first is what we call the water management project. This is a project conducted at the field scale and taking place at Discovery Farm Langham. And really the goal of this is to look at different BMPs for their ability to optimize nutrient and water use efficiency across the field. So it started going back to the fall of 2020, where we identified 8 mini watersheds or basins within a field with a collective area of about 40 acres. And so you can see those basins on this LiDAR image on the screen outlined in the black polygons. And then surface ditches were constructed to channel water from the basins out to an approved outlet, working in consultation with the Water Security Agency. And so from these, it provides us with a location of collecting water to measure nutrient characteristics, as well as understand what impact these treatments might have on promoting things like infiltration and that sort of thing. So once the construction was completed, then there was a 2-year field study initially initiated to look at these different management practices. The first is a control treatment, which is an annual grain crop. In the 2021 season, it was flax. In the 2022 season, we'll be looking at wheat. And then different treatments within that annual grain crop, including post-harvest crop residue management, so a light tillage event, variable rate fertilizer application, whereby we're reducing our total amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus being applied relative to the control treatment to see if we can make use of some of those residual nutrients that tend to accumulate in these low areas and prevent losses in runoff water. And then a annual forage polycropping treatment as well as another management practice to look at. So this project was initially started as a 2-year field study, and I'm thankful just to have the recent support of Sask wheat and Sask canola to extend the scope of this project as well, to look at multiple years of crop rotation on this project as well. Now, in terms of the sampling approach for each of these basins, really we're trying to track how the nutrients are moving through the soil, water, and plant system. And so to do that, I have a transect of sampling locations across each basin. I'll direct your attention to the figure on the left, where the blue numbers relate to the transect points, so 6 points across each basin. But ultimately, I'm trying to understand differences in soil water dynamics across the landscape. So particularly focusing on 3 landscape positions, be it knoll tops as in number 1, mid slopes in number 2, or the depression areas in number 3. On this slide here, I just want to show sort of what we started out as for the baseline condition in phosphorus in both the runoff water and the soil. So the figure on the top here is reporting soluble reactive phosphorus in parts per billion. So this is dissolved inorganic phosphorus across our different basins. You can see certainly there is some variation in terms of the concentrations that were measured, but in a statistical sense, no significant impact of the basin on what we measured in the runoff water before we implemented any of the treatments. Looking at the soil in the table on the bottom, this is modified Kelowna extractable phosphorus in micrograms per gram, and across the different treatments and the landscape positions, again, no significant influence on those measured phosphate concentrations. So the reason why I share this is that really what we're seeing here is we have relative homogeneous nature in these basins before we started the trial. So I think it does speak to, really the ability to look at what we're seeing in terms of how effective these management practices are over the years of the study. Before I go into the results, I do want to speak to the growing season conditions. So I think I've mentioned it already before, but 2021 was a challenging growing season at our Discovery Farm site. I'm reporting here monthly precipitation over the growing season in 2021. And you can see that much of the precipitation when it did come was in May, which was good for germination, but really had low amounts in June and July. And then we got some late in August following harvest, or as the crop was approaching harvest. And then comparing 2020 numbers, just for reference, which I wouldn't consider it a wet year, but much higher precipitation. In this figure here, we're looking at grain and straw yield according to our different treatments. So from left to right across the bottom, our control treatment, R for crop residue management, F for variable rate fertilizer application, and P for the forage polycropping. For straw yield, our forage treatment had the highest yield. I don't think this is surprising, as we know that forages are bred for their biomass production. But perhaps more interesting, I want to draw your attention to the grain yield on the flax treatment. So C, R, and F, this is the orange bars. And there was no significant difference among the treatments. So importantly, when we think about that, we see there was no yield penalty from implementing the variable rate fertilizer treatment compared to the control, despite the fact that there was a reduction in the total amount of nutrients being applied. So I think this is a signal that this VR approach does have an ability to promote nutrient use efficiency, which is an interesting observation. Just looking at the economic analysis, comparing these two treatments. So I have the variable rate fertilizer and the control, showing the yield and then the amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen applied relative to the control. So again, for the VR treatment, about 90% of the phosphorus and 88% of the nitrogen. And then the variable input costs, this is the input costs associated with strictly that treatment. So if you compare the difference, this would be the difference associated with costs for the fertilizer and the seed implemented in the VR program. And so in this case, we see that variable rate fertilizer application resulted in savings of $22.75 per hectare. Looking at the landscape positions for yield, so we can see both for the grain and the straw yield, our highest yields was in these low-lying areas, landscape position 3, where that water accumulated. We also looked at nutrient uptake in the straw for phosphorus and nitrogen. I do want to point your attention to this landform complex, where again, there was a significant impact on nutrient uptake, where we had the highest uptake from these low-lying areas. In terms of the uptake in the straw, not surprising that the uptake was greatest from the forage treatment, but it will be interesting to see if there was any difference in the flax treatments in the grain uptake of nutrients, which I'll be looking at as that data becomes available. So again, to sum this up, I think we saw that there was relative uniformity among the basins, which is a good basis for understanding, how effective these BMPs are over time. And there was no yield penalty from this variable rate fertilizer application, despite a net reduction in nutrients being applied. Now let's talk about variable rate manure application. So if you allow me to expand the scope of the talk here somewhat to go outside of the bounds of fertilizer, but I think manure is an important conversation as well, perhaps, given the high price of fertilizer, but also for its ability to supply, in addition to macronutrients, also micronutrients and other beneficial things such as organic matter that may help to build productivity of our soils. So for this, I'll talk about work being led by Dr. Jeff Shano at the Livestock and Forage Center of Excellence. And looking at the screen here, just to give you the context, we have 3 different treatments of nutrient management, including variable rate manure, constant rate manure, and then commercial fertilizer, sort of as a control situation. And this study over multiple years is looking at the impacts on crops, soils, water quality, greenhouse gases across different watersheds. This image here shows the equipment that was used. So a 30-foot JBS manure variable rate spreader with a spreading width of 30 feet. And in this instance, the variable rate program was developed by Echelon using 16 years of NDVI imagery. In terms of the strategy being used, in this instance, the less productive upslope locations receive the highest amount of manure, and then the rate decreased sort of as you move downslope, with no manure being applied in the center of the basins. So again, I think this can be a good strategy, especially for manure application, insofar as its ability to maybe improve the productivity of these upslope locations with the goal of adding organic matter to improve water holding capacity and those sorts of things. So what Dr. Shano has found so far, the variable rate prescription has done a good job of sort of smoothing out yield across the site. And the initially the elimination of manure from the basin centers did not result in a yield penalty. However, after 4 years of cropping, this is starting to show up. So I think this highlights the importance of soil testing every year and setting our rate accordingly to make sure that we're not having a net long-term reduction and drawing down those nutrient reserves over time. We saw that there was a reduced soil available phosphorus and nitrate in these low slope positions in the VR treatment. And this signals to a potential environmental benefit from these reduced rates. And that was seen in lower concentrations in the runoff water and emissions in these treatments as well. So to sum it up in Dr. Shiano's words, keep the manure out of the sloughs is the take-home message from this study. The last study I'll point to is to again touch on this piece of fertilizer source by rate interactions. And to talk about that, I'll talk about the other study in my PhD research, which I'm thankful for the support of Sask wheat and other commodity associations for this project. It's being conducted at 3 sites, including one at Discovery Farm Langham on a mid-slope location, and then 2 sites near Central Butte, including an upslope and a low slope. This is a traditional small plot replicated study with 3 different factors of treatments, including 8 phosphorus fertilizer sources and a control, 2 rates of 20 and 40 kilograms of P2O5 per hectare, and 2 placement methods. So sideband at seeding versus surface broadcast immediately prior to seeding. And one of the questions that I'm interested in this project is agronomic performance of fertilizer products influenced by interactions amongst the 4 R's? So this slide here just shows the different fertilizer phosphorus sources by name and their chemical analysis. So we had sources with just phosphorus in them, sources with nitrogen and phosphorus, importantly, of course, monoammonium phosphate, and then sources with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, such as MAP plus MST or ammonium phosphate sulfate. Now, I do want to point out that while there's different types of fertilizer that I mentioned, basal rates of nitrogen and sulfur were made to balance out those rates across all the treatments. So there isn't sort of a impact of just sulfur being applied in those sources. Again, both at the Langham, but at the Central Butte site, we did have some drought conditions which impacted our yield results. Looking at the yield, I won't dwell on this in too much detail, but this is the yield from our upslope site at Central Butte, where we saw a significant impact of fertilizer source on both the grain and the straw yield. And then looking at our low slope location, in this instance, we saw an impact of the interaction between the fertilizer source and the rate. So just to walk you along the x-axis, first the letter codes relate to the abbreviations of the fertilizer sources, and then followed by H for the high rate and L for the low rate. So again, not to really dwell too much on what we observed, but other than the fact that there was a significant interaction effect of fertilizer source by rate on the grain yield. And we saw a similar interaction at our Langham site. In this slide here, we looked at phosphorus uptake and nitrogen uptake in the straw. And in this case, there was a significant impact according to the phosphorus fertilizer source, where we saw the highest uptake in our MAP plus MST treatment. And in terms of placement method, highest uptake from the sideband relative to broadcast. So in terms of discussion, in this instance, we saw that fertilizer phosphorus sources containing the phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur in a single granule had the highest straw yield and uptake, perhaps signaling some sort of synergistic effect. In terms of uptake of the nutrients in the straw, it was significantly influenced by fertilizer source and placement method. And this was a really interesting observation for me. When we think of plant availability of fertilizer phosphorus, previous work has shown that it is strongly influenced by its solubility in water. And so I think, especially in the dry year that we had, differences in solubility among the sources could have an impact on their plant availability and uptake. So again, I think this is an instance of where looking at this interaction of the fertilizer source and maybe our predicted moisture status across the field might be something to look into. I do recognize that, when you're dealing with multiple sources, that is a logistical consideration. It's a tank on your commodity cart and whatnot. But I think going back to the example of how we use ESN and phosphorus in our demonstration project, it is something that can be implemented. Looking at straw phosphorus uptake, we saw it was highest from the MST treatment, again, where all these nutrients are applied together. And previous work has shown an improved plant phosphorus uptake from the combined application of MAP and sulfur fertilizer. And finally, in soil placement of that fertilizer in a side band resulted in the greatest phosphorus uptakes. And this agrees with what we know about 4R nutrients stewardship, where we see good early response from in-soil placement of fertilizer products. So with that, I'd like to wind things down. Thank you for taking the time to go with me on this whirlwind journey through projects we have at Langham. But I will encourage you, for those interested in learning more, feel free to check out Discovery Farm's 2021 field report, where we go into a lot more detail on all of those studies, except for the one at the Livestock and Forage Center of Excellence. But I also encourage you to check out our website for more information on the projects, and follow us on Twitter, both our account Discovery Farm SK, and personally you can find me at Blake_Weiseth. And finally, I do want to acknowledge a number of organizations that come together to fund my PhD research, Sask, of course, being one of them, and the other groups on the screen here. So thank you to all those organizations, and thank you to everyone for taking in this webinar. Happy to address any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Blake. That was a lot of great information. It's good to have a lot of very new information and practical information that farmers can apply to their farms. I think you covered it, because there aren't any questions here. So unless I see anything coming through here in the next couple minutes, I'm just going to share my screen here real quick so people can get our information. Share that.
Yeah, I know, sometimes you think of a great question afterwards too, so no problem. I definitely encourage anyone, they can feel free to reach out, connect with me on Twitter, can find my information on the website as well, and happy to talk at length. And as I mentioned before too, one of the things that I'm personally interested in addition to telling the story of what we're doing, but also hearing from others, what are the things that are interesting to you, and so far as research or demonstration projects that we can look at going forward too. So
absolutely. And if anyone can't find Blake's information and has a question, please send them to me, or at the info address on your screen there, and we're happy to forward those questions on to Blake as well. And I should mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and if you have any, if you want to watch this later, or if you want to forward this on to somebody, just check out our website in a couple days, or our YouTube page, and we'll have that up on there. And we do have one question that just came in here from Wayne Truman. He says, Blake, have you noticed any differences in wheat protein levels by different fertilizer options?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Great question. So what I can say is in the water management project and the other small plot project that I have referenced, we are tracking the nutrient concentrations in the grain as well. So I don't have an answer for you now, but stay tuned, and that's certainly something that we'll be looking at, because I do think that that can be important. The other thing I will mention too, Wayne, and it's another example, I didn't touch on it in this presentation, but at our Field of Excellence project at Langham in the 2020 season, we did also have a variable rate top dress UAN application. And so I think that's another way that you can kind of potentially look at split application, variable rate application, potentially trying to target some of those protein bumps, from a later season application. So sorry, I don't have a better answer for you right now, but great question. And I've made a note of that, something to report on in future presentations.
Great. And we have one more question here. Anhydrous inhibitors in spring one-pass seeding from Cecil.
Yeah, great question, Cecil. So I guess you're kind of asking, what's my opinion of them, or, is it a good practice to consider? I will say that, I think anhydrous application, certainly, its efficacy or its strength is influenced by, your conditions at the time of application, moisture, is that furrow closing in, after you're applying it. So I think it is, something to consider. Certainly, I think it would be largely dictated by, the conditions at your site, insofar as their effectiveness. I will say that I don't personally have much experience on those anhydrous inhibitor products, though. In terms of enhanced efficiency, again, we have made use of that ESN previously in some of our work at Langham, and but that's really the extent of our enhanced efficiency products so far.
Okay. Well, that's the extent of the Q&As here. So I think we're going to leave it at that. So before we sign off today, I just want to give a quick thanks to Discovery Farm for partnering with Sask Wheat on this webinar today. Again, thank you to Blake for this great presentation. And again, if you have any questions, Blake's information was on the screen. We're going to have this up on YouTube, and our information is right there. And always get in contact with us, and we're happy to answer your question or find the right person to answer your question. And so thank you for attending today, and I wish everyone the best as you prepare for seeding. Bye-bye.